Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the HIGHERWAY podcast. I'm Bob, your host, and over in Germany, we've got my good friend Heiko. Good evening, Heiko. How are you doing?
Good evening and cheers.
Beer, the answer to all of life's problems.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we were talking just before we went on air about what we were going to be talking about tonight. And the subject of the treatises that we work from, because I know people watching this who are interested in European martial arts, and I think we're getting I know I'm certainly getting a lot of interest from people who've never been involved in it before, and they've enjoyed listening to you talk about, you know, the historical aspects as well as the practical aspects of broadsword. We've talked a little bit about small sword, the dirk, the taj, and Highland culture in general. But it would be interesting to talk to you about, you know, the type of works that we use to develop our ideas, the treatises, as it were. So,
yeah, right.
Who we're going to start with, McBain, or who do we start with?
McBain is the most entertaining of all.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, that's why I mentioned him. You know.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, Let's start with McBain, because I think McBain is in that way kind of unique, because McBain not only offers us a very interesting and very practical treatise on the use of the small sword, the broadsword, and other weapons. He also offers in his manual not only fencing manual, but also his life story, so his autobiography. So we know what he did. We know who he was. We know where he had duels and which battles he fought, and a lot of sieges, because he was serving in the army of the Duke of Marlborough, and around 1700, and he was a lot in France and Flanders, and also in Germany, and not many people know, who are not interested in the topic, is that there are very famous field battles during this time of the period, during this wars, but there were a lot of sieges, and you can read it in McBain's life story, that he is mentioning a lot of sieges. So he's, we were storming like 6 times in there, and I got a bullet in my left thigh, and I got a bayonet thrust here, and I got stabbed here, and then we were, storming another city, and then we were storming another city. So he's mentioning a lot of these sieges, and you can follow his life story quite easy. It's a really interesting story. They should made not only a movie, they should made a Netflix show out of it, with a lot of parts about young McBain fighting Highlanders in battle, and later, traveling through Europe, being a gambler and a pimp and a notorious duelist and whatnot. So I think, even so, if not all people, or not many people, might work from McBain as a fencing manual, but I think so many people enjoy his story.
It's an absolutely incredible story, isn't it?
It is, and McBain therefore also offers something about him, so we know who he was and where he lived. So other fencing masters are, with their biography, a little bit in the dark. So you don't know a lot about every fencing master and where he got his material from. But we know it from some, and so
What I like about McBain is in his autobiography, he's very honest about how he felt when with his first fights, because basically he ran away. He was terrified, as a young soldier, and he decided that, which is quite revealing, isn't it? Because often when these teachers write about themselves, they omit the material that's really important, which makes the teacher more human. We know that, most people in a battle would be frightened, and he admits that quite freely.
He ran 2 times in his first 2 battles.
That's right, yes.
And he got his ass kicked in his first duel. And
Yeah.
I mean, he was not only defeated, he was humiliated. So the guy was hitting his ass with the flat of his blade, you know, striking with that, and,
Yeah.
and taking away the sword he borrowed from another guy.
Yeah.
So I think that's honesty. I mean,
Yeah.
find a martial arts instructor or you know, a self-defense instructor who's telling you how he got his ass kicked for the first time. There are some who are
Yeah, there are
like
some,
that,
not many.
not many. Yeah.
No.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah, that's what I like about McBain. He really seems to be an honest guy.
oh, totally.
So
And he doesn't seem to care what you think either. It's like, this is my story. Here it is.
Yeah.
Yes, I also ran brothels. Yes,
Yeah.
I've been shot and stabbed many times. Yes, I've lost fights, you know,
yeah.
but I carried on. I mean, that's what the message says. His stories about resilience. You know, we talk about resilience these days, but I mean, this is a story of resilience, motivation, self-confidence, you know, all of those attributes that we talk about developing as men. I mean, he exemplified all of those qualities over the period of his life. And I think I'm right in saying his last fight was when he was 63, wasn't it?
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah, he was in his 60s when he had his last gladiatorial duel.
Yeah, right.
And I believe he battered the guy with a dusak, a wooden dusak.
Yeah, no, they used what sometimes was called falchion, but it was more like a hanger. So
okay.
Yeah. So we can see this. James Miller shows it in his manual. There you can see a typical, like an infantry short sword, like an infantry cutlass or hanger. Yeah. And they were often called falchions, and they not always they had a knuckle guard. Sometimes they had just a simple cross guard or something like that. So we can see this. We can see this also on pictures when they had articles about announcing a prize fight.
Yeah, there were images in the bottom. I remember looking at one of the images, like one of the posters for one of his famous fights, and there were different weapons lying on the floor.
Yeah, right.
By his feet, I think. They're both standing, prize fighting on a stage, obviously. And there were a variety of weapons that obviously they'd been probably using in that fight, you know. And it was also his ability to use a variety of weapons as well.
Yeah, the small sword obviously was his favorite weapon, but he is already approved for having you know, one system of combat and adopting to different weapons. What we talked about in the former in the other videos about having one art and using different weapons. So his main chapter is about the small sword, but he also talks about the back sword, about the shearing sword or spadroon. He talks about how to. He's also talking a lot about how to face other types of weapons and how to use them if you have to. So he's speaking about how the Portuguese and the Spaniards using the rapier and the dagger. And he's also talking about how you could use it if you have to, because obviously when you are on a battlefield and you're fighting, you know, Spaniards and you lose your own weapon and you grab the next weapon on the floor, or for some other reason. So he's talking a lot about different weapons, but also things like how to face a fighter with broadsword and targe, and you have a small sword or spadroon. So he says, okay, you should wrap your coat around your arm to have kind of a shield, and so on and so on. He gives a lot of good advices, and sometimes I think with you know, a wink of his eye. So like, you know, you have to take care. Some people have dirt in their pockets, and they throw it into they throw it into your face. So I would never do something like this, but other guys would do this. So you know, he has kind of these it's okay, Donald. You
I'm
would
sure
never
he
do
did.
something like that.
I'm sure if anybody was going to have dirt in his pocket, it would be McBain.
And that I like about his fencing of his book, the fencing part, is it's kind of, what can I call it? Kind of streetwise. You know what I mean? He is telling you stories he really has experience with. So it's not very often really a how-to manual, but more like some tips and tricks and advices, what you should keep in mind.
Yeah.
And therefore, I mean, this work is really pure gold. Absolutely.
I mean,
it's
yeah, you can read it and reread it. And
yeah,
what
yeah,
I've found, as I'm sure you have, you read it once and you think, wow, this is amazing, particularly his autobiography. But then you start reading it a little bit at a time. So you pick it up and you really look at it in detail, and there's so much
yeah,
information in there that you
yeah.
could easily miss.
It's one of the
It reminded me of George Silver's Paradoxes of Self-Defense.
Mhm.
The English swordsman, George Silver, from a period before MacBain, obviously, but that was written in a very similar style, where it was partly autobiographical as well as practical, and the
Yeah,
paradoxes of self-defense was quite amazing. Um, in that, George Silver talks about he derides the Italian method. He hated the Italian method and was
yeah,
always keen to tell you about how many Italians he'd beaten in
yeah.
taverns in London.
Yeah,
you know.
yeah. I think so George Silver, I always look into George Silver a bit, not directly into the source, but I really follow, since I started with HEMA, I follow the work of Paul Wagner and
Oh, Paul
Stephen
Wagner,
Hand
yeah, yeah,
from the Stoccata school in Australia.
yeah,
And I have the book, I have the videos Stephen Hand made, so I always look into interpretations of Silver.
yeah,
And because for me, for the 18th century broadsword and backsword, George Silver is kind of, I would not say the grandfather or grandfather, but kind of the weird grumpy grand uncle. Everyone is always a little bit embarrassed about. You know what
yeah,
I mean?
yeah, 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 yeah. That's
Yeah.
a really good description, actually. Yeah, sort of
Yeah.
leave him in the corner. Just give him a
Yeah.
drink and leave him
Yeah.
in the corner. Yeah,
Right. But he always has some interesting stories to tell, and
yeah.
then he's getting grumpy and yelling about foreigners and
That's
Italians
right.
and
Yeah,
whatnot.
yeah,
And
yeah,
so
yeah,
this kind of, but it's really interesting, and I think when you look into George Silver, you could say for the system we train, it's kind of a forefather manual. So it's
yeah,
worth to have a look into it to understand where some of the things we are doing
yeah,
with a Highland broadsword coming from. Even
yeah,
so, it's still different in many ways, but I think it's kind of, what you can say, there's a starting point if you
yeah,
want to pick the the earliest manual. And then the latest manual you could pick might be Alfred Hutton, because Hutton obviously still is doing military saber, but he is looking backwards in history and saying, okay,
yeah.
we can learn a lot from 18th century English backsword fencing
Mm.
to make our military saber of the 19th century more effective.
So, of course, at one end we've got Alfred Hutton. At the beginning, the genesis is sort of Silver.
Yeah,
So
kind
we've
of,
got all those other
uh,
people in between,
yeah,
obviously Hope and Mathewson, Zachary Wilde, people
yeah,
like
right.
that, and then we mentioned earlier,
Yeah,
um,
I would say that the core and the center of all are, of course, the 18th century manuals, or let's say late 17th to early 19th century
yeah,
manuals. As you said, Roworth, Taylor, Mathewson, the Angelos, Zachary Wilde, and also Hope. They all are, of course, in details. They are, of course, different and in description and in focus and everything, but basically for me, and this is how the Cateran Society works, we have a range of manuals from roughly over 100 years
yeah,
describing the same weapon and basically the same fencing system, of course with some differences in details, but every one of the guys knew an outside guard and an inside guard and a hanging guard. Okay, and they were all talking about basically the same weapon or the same weapon type family, the backsword, broadsword. No
yeah,
matter if it's a Highland broadsword or English cavalry backsword or something like that, or later the cavalry saber and spadroon and such things.
mm,
So and of course, you can make some differences between the sources. Also, when you see Zachary Wilde and Hope and MacBain, they are all always about small sword and broadsword. So they are like, okay, if you want to be a complete swordsman, I think Wild is telling that when you want to be a complete swordsman, you have to know the small sword and the backsword.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you are not a complete swordsman. And later we have, of course, a little bit more of a separation, but still masters in the second half of the 18th century still tell you if you want to learn thrusting properly, you should learn the small sword. So my opinion is that still fencing masters said, okay, you have to know the small sword and the broadsword, but the manuals were changing and focusing more on having how-to manuals for backsword or broadsword fencing to be used as drill manuals for military education. So like, for example, Captain Sinclair or Angelo and also Matthewson. Yeah.
Mm. And we have a quick drink.
I mean, broadswords and beer have something in common. They both begin with a capital B, and they both are great. And nothing better than a cold brew after having a broadsword bout, right?
Well, or maybe a couple of drinks before you have a bout, which I'm sure McBain.
Yeah, I mean, if you you know that a lot of German beer companies, bigger breweries, made a lot of commercials about that. Beer is kind of a sport drink after sport.
Oh, okay, yeah, an after sports drink.
It's full of vitamins and minerals, and it's I don't know if it's a word in English, isotonic. You know
isotonic,
what I mean?
So replace,
like a sports drink. And I mean, it's personally, I think when we have our Thursday evening training and I come back home from training, it's always quite good, or we have a small kitchen in the gym where we are training, to have a beer after training. So I think it's not so stupid to have a refreshing beer. I mean, it of course it can be without alcohol if it must be, of course. But but then it's a soft drink,
that's like coffee without caffeine. You know what I mean?
It's the same taste, but it's not. Yeah, it's not the same thing. But
it's not the same.
Yeah.
It's not the same. No.
It's like a blunt broadsword for home defense.
I was actually going to say it's like a basket hilt sword. Yeah. It's a basket hilt sword without the blade, so it has no effect. Has no effectiveness whatsoever.
I mean, you can still use it as a big knuckle duster.
You could punch someone with it. Yeah.
At least, yeah.
It's funny how we've gone from very important discussions on the treatises to alcohol in like one step.
Yeah, but it's a really important discussion about alcohol, because
and I think it's time somebody actually wrote a treatise on drinking with swordplay for the Cateran Society. There's about time. There's definitely a book there.
I mean, keep in mind, we have in Germany still the law of beer brewing purity, which is basing in the 16th century. So on the back of every German beer, there is a sentence written that this beer is brewed after the German Reinheitsgebot. So it's still a thing, People are fencing with longswords like 16th century masters, and they are brewing and drinking like 16th century monks or something like that. I don't know. But
to be honest, when the treatises were written and we had swordsmen like McBain about in the 18th century, we couldn't really drink water because it was dangerous. So you would drink ale.
Yeah.
Everybody drank ale because it was safer. It was a much safer option.
So that's how the grog was invented in the Navy. Yeah. Because you have foul water and you still can drink it because you need to drink it, but you have to put some rum into it, so it doesn't taste so anymore.
Foul.
Yeah. So foul. Yeah. Right. So I think. I mean, as far as we know, martial arts and also making alcohol, especially brewing beer, is very old. I mean, we have old I think we have already old depictions of people fighting from the Babylonians, and we already have beer brewing since the time of the Babylonians. So
Yeah.
I think it's legit to mix both topics.
Yeah. Well, that's fine. That's absolutely fine. It's okay by me.
Okay.
I thought, when I spoke to you earlier on Messenger about tonight's meeting, you said make sure we got beer. I thought, yeah, well, a good idea. So,
yeah, right. Because the last times we were meeting in the morning, so we had coffee and tea. But yeah, this is kind of during the when we had this hard lockdown in Germany, as everyone else had. We came up with the idea, friends, and we were making a virtual Irish pub. So we were meeting online, and having some beer and whatnot, and it worked better than we expected, because it became quite funny, especially when more than one beer was going down the throats. And a colleague of mine, to wrap up the alcohol topic, a colleague of mine said to me, we have to take care that in 2020 we have more alcohol in our throats than on our hands. And this is, because of all the disinfection, this is kind of a big challenge, but you can do it. I try. So
yeah, you're doing your best.
Yeah, I don't want to rub alcohol on my hands. I want to have it in my throat and going down to my stomach.
Yeah,
and,
that's absolutely true. So that's a very good. It's a good point.
Cheers.
A good statement.
Prost.
More alcohol down my neck than on my hands. Yeah. So that would be our resolution.
Yeah, but
yeah.
But back to the manual.
Back to the main topic.
Yeah. So we talked a lot about Donald McBain, but we also use other manuals. So quickly mentioning, within the Cateran Society system, we have mainly use of McBain, Thomas Page, Lonergan, who was probably Irish. We don't know much about him, but it is said he because of the name, he maybe was Irish. We have, of course, the Angelos, we have Matthewson, we have Sinclair, and we have these Rowers-Taylor, Rowers/Taylor manuals. And what we don't use a lot at the moment is Sir William Hope. But some people like me are looking into Sir William Hope. And also my, at the moment, favorite how-to manual, Zachary Wyatt, who was an English fencing master, and he published his little book in 1711. But as I mentioned before, maybe I really like his manual because he has smallsword, he has backsword, he has quarterstaff, and the two weapons are the base for his quarterstaff. And he has a very interesting section about wrestling, a chapter about wrestling, but I can talk about this a little bit later. So when we see the sources we are using, most of them are in the military sector, especially in the second half of the 18th century and the early 19th century. So they were made as training manuals for a specific, whatever, volunteer horse troop or something like that. Or in the first half, we often have kind of these manuals which are written for civilians and military men, for both sections.
Yeah.
And so this is what we call in the Cateran Society, we make a slight distinction between this regimental style and the earlier old style. But of course, both parts of the 18th century are mixing a little bit at some points. But it's easier to say, okay, let's work with Thomas Page in this old style because he does some things quite differently, and learn about how he did it with equilibrio and everything. And Angelo and Rowers-Taylor is a little bit different, even though we know that Rowers-Taylor took a lot from the Thomas Page manual and put it in his own manual. So like the traversing footwork and some other things. And but we use a range of manuals, and then in the early 19th century, it starts to flatten out a little bit. because we have, for example, Robert Taylor. I think he was in the late 18th century. He was first published, and then he had, I think, second, third, and even fourth edition, I think. And I think the last edition was published in 1824. So we can say the fencing style we have around the Napoleonic Wars was still in use until, I would say, the mid 19th century, so in the 1850s, 1860s. And then we start to get a strong influence from, for example, Italian dual saber school. But still, when you look at Wade or Alfred Hutton and all the other 19th century English fencing masters for military saber, you still can see they do a lot of things like the numbered cutting system and so on. They do a lot of things which have their root in this Napoleonic style of military fencing, which is basing on this kind of earlier Highland broadsword and backsword style, which they were using in the 18th century.
And I've noticed with the Cateran Society, what Chris did in the early, obviously when he put it together, was he extrapolated some of the most important points out for the first level of the apprenticeship program. And it's not until you get to the second level like you start looking at the other treatises, I guess, in depth. Obviously, that doesn't stop you looking at them now whilst you're training, but certainly that, I think, to a certain extent, that was the genius of what he was capable of doing, wasn't it? It was extrapolating that information from the treatises and putting it together in a way that would prepare you to handle the treatises that much easier when you approach them. It certainly was, from my point of view. You know, it gives you a starting point. I mean, would you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. It makes sense because the later manuals from the second half of the 18th century and early 19th century, for example, a Mathewson or Sinclair, are much easier to understand as a how-to manual than, for example, McBain or Wilde or Thomas Page. So sometimes they say, okay, for example, you don't have a numbered cutting system at this time, okay? But later you know what a cut number 1, what a cut number 2, or cut number 3 is. So when he says, he's cutting outside, so this can mean, you know, the outside of your head or your shoulder. If he's not specific about it, say if he's cutting outside to your right cheek, okay, this is obvious. But if he's just vague about he's cutting outside and you parry it, okay, what do I use for a parry? An outside guard, inside guard? Maybe he don't care, I don't know. So for a start, it's easier to take the later manuals because footwork and the guards and cuts are much better described, because these manuals were mostly intended to be, for example, for a drill instructor. So here you have a manual, and after this manual, you know fencing already. After this manual, you can work and teach recruits, for example. While the older manuals are a little bit more like speaking from fencing master to fencing master and sharing your experience from, you know, like the last 40 years of fighting and foiling and gambling and brawling like McBain did. And but still, so this is easy. This is a much easier start. So we start with a younger material because it's easier to understand, to get fundamentals, and from there you can explore the older manuals because then you have an understanding of fencing theory already.
It does make a lot more sense. And I noticed that with the later treatises that there was a clearer explanation, often with lots of pictures and diagrams. But you look at McBain's, there are a few images. There are a few pictures. But as you say, the text is quite ambiguous. It's quite, you can make quite a lot out of it. What does he mean by that? But if, as you say, if you have that knowledge from the later works, it's easier to start to make sense of it.
And McBain is an example. It's not so easy to follow his text because his interpunction, points and colons and whatnot, it's missing sometimes or quite loose. You don't know when one sentence stops and the next one begins sometimes. So it's good to watch such manuals when you have already a little bit experience with the younger material.
So, I mean, because obviously I'm I'm an English speaker. So if I'm having trouble learning it, how do you manage?
Yeah, a funny thing is, personally, I have the feeling I understand 18th century English better than, for example, 15th or 16th century German.
Oh, okay.
But that's just me. Maybe because the English of the 18th century is closer to the English we speak today in many ways.
Okay, yeah.
Maybe it's easier to understand. I don't know, because I really, when I read German sources like Joachim Meyer, for example, I sometimes do not know what he really means. I can understand what he's saying, but it's too, if he does this and then you do that, and if he does this and then he does that, and then you do this. And I mean, there are obviously a lot of people, even not German native speakers, who are training German longsword and using the sources and understanding them well. But I have my troubles. This was not a main reason for choosing English manuals, but yeah, from my experience, I have less problems to understand the English manuals than the old German ones. So because the English they use is closer to the English I learned.
Yeah, no, that makes, I understand, that makes sense. So, I mean, when you first got into European sword, because we talked about this many podcasts ago, what was your starting point? What was the treatise you started with, or did you just look at all of them? And
yeah, I took a kind of a overview, because back then I think they still publish them or have them published on the ARMA website, the old ARMA website of John Clements. There were some manuals as PDF,
right?
And I was, looking in everything they offered, and I think I was quite. They also had from Angelo's Hungarian Highland Broadswords. They had a PDF file of that.
Yeah.
And this was something that hooked me immediately, because, as I said, I was much more interested in the period of the 18th century than about medieval things. But the first manual which really got me was Joachim Meyer, because of the pictures. I think the Higgins Armory Guild or something like that, they offered all pictures online, and I've found that pictures quite fascinating. So this was the first manual I had a visual impression of. So because many of the longsword things reminded me of my kendo stuff I trained.
Yeah, of course.
Or I said, this would be also cool, to use a surprising old German longsword technique in a kendo tournament and surprise the guys. But I looked in a lot of things, but I came quite quickly to the Highland broadsword and English backsword stuff, because this was something I already liked when I get into HEMA slowly. So this was something which was fascinating me. Scottish history, 18th century, and things like that.
Yeah.
So I was, of course, looking into Renaissance sources from Italy and Germany, just to understand what is happening there, what is there else, what is the history of European fencing. But my focus was quite quickly on all this 18th century material. Okay. So Alfred Hutton was also one of the sources first sources I looked into. To get an understanding. Yeah, because they had PDF file of his cold steel manual, of his saber manual, and they also he had this book, Old Sword Play. There was a PDF file of Old Sword Play where he's showing also not only Italian side sword but also small sword and back sword. Alfred Hutton, he was kind of a historical fencer himself, because he was looking into the old stuff and tried to use it in his days. And so this was also one book that brought me closer to the Highland broadsword and things like that.
And he also has a fantastic mustache. if I remember.
Absolutely. Absolutely. He and a photo of Pierre Vigny Bartitsu guy, you know, the stick
Yeah,
fighting
yeah,
guy,
yeah,
Pierre
yeah,
Vigny.
of course. Yeah, yeah.
There is one famous picture of him in his fencing outfit with a walking stick and his beautiful mustache there, of course.
Oh yeah. Well, maybe that's what I should
Right.
start doing now. I
Yeah.
should start waxing it, and maybe my fencing will get better.
Mm.
But the good thing about Hutton, because I've got a few of Hutton's works, it's very clear, isn't it? It's quite easy to follow.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's the great thing about Hutton.
And
It's a good starting point to a certain extent, isn't it? Because
yeah,
even
right,
some of the
right.
Roworth and Taylor can be a bit misleading in places because of punctuation and so on. Although it's clearer than, certainly clearer than McBain or Wilde or Lonergan or even Matthewson. Matthewson's is still quite, although it's got quite a few pictures, they're not particularly brilliant, are they? You know.
No, but I think also Matthewson is. I worked a lot with Matthewson, so Sinclair is now my main source when it comes to broadsword basics. But I also still use a lot of Matthewson. But Matthewson was the first source I was working a lot with after working through the Cateran Society program with the regimental broadsword, which is very much basing a lot on Angelo in the base. So a lot of stuff is from Angelo. And then we had these lesson series where Chris Thompson was making 10 lessons of each of other Highland broadsword manuals. So I was making 10 lessons after Sinclair and 10 lessons after Thomas Matthewson, and I was looking a lot in Thomas Matthewson because I was lucky to have there was in HIGHERWAY bookshelf, the publishing house. They published a lot of HEMA stuff back then in the early 2000s, and I was lucky to that I bought back then not only English Swordsmanship by Stephen Hand, but also the two books on Highland broadsword. The first one by Mark Rector, and I think Paul Wagner was also involved, where they had a reprint of Donald McBain and also Sir William Hope. And in the second book, they had reprints of Sinclair, Archibald MacGregor, I think, Matthewson, Roworth Taylor, and kind of a bad copy of the poster by Angelo. So I had these sources already before I had PDF files of them. So I had it printed, you know. This was something which was fascinating me. The other thing which was fascinating me, and I have it here in the book Lessons of the Broadsword Masters, was a picture of, I don't know if you can see this.
Yes, I can see it.
The famous
James Figg.
kind of a business card, or like a business card of James Figg being portrayed as a stage gladiator.
Yeah.
And somewhere in my online research, I found this picture. And this was something which was really fascinating me. And many people know James Figg as being kind of the father of modern boxing. I mean, he's even a Hall of Famer, I think.
Yeah.
But not many people knew back then that James Figg was also a fencing master, because being a master of the noble science of defense back then meant that you were able to fight with a small sword, with a broadsword, with a quarterstaff, with a range of different weapons, and also unarmed. Yeah. So this was something which was also fascinating me.
I mean, he was. I mean, some of Figg's prodigies were Whittaker and Broughton, Jack Broughton, who was a famous bare knuckle boxer, I believe, and George Taylor as well. So he had these quite a reputation as a pugilist as well as a swordsman. So
right. So
because effective self-defense in those days did mean a whole range of weapon systems, not just empty hands, you know. And it's funny because a lot of the martial artists now spend most of their time just learning to use their hands, their legs, their elbows, and so on, and give little or show little desire to pick up a weapon. Certainly, I can speak from the Thai martial arts point of view. Krabi Krabong is such an important part of Muay Thai and the Thai culture. I had to do it. you know, so
Yeah.
I can pick up 2 swords if I need to, double swords, single sword,
Yeah.
a plong, which is a big staff, you know, very big quarterstaff, a spear, a gout, an axe, a shield, mysock, wooden elbows. But you speak to Thai boxers nowadays and they'll say, what do you mean? A mysock? And I say
Yeah.
a mysock. You know where your
Yeah.
elbows came from the mysock?
Yeah.
And they go, what's
Yeah.
a mysock? I said, it's a wooden elbow. Mysock means wooden elbow.
Yeah.
And I give them
Yeah.
a darb. I go, look, if you're standing your guard, put your darb in your hand. What's a darb? And you go, oh. And
Yeah.
it's become just a sport of Muay
Mm.
Thai, which is okay, but
Mm.
the whole art is vanishing slowly. And even things like the ramui, the pre-fight rituals,
Yeah.
which we always do before a fight, in venues now in the UK and Europe, they don't allow you to do it. No, we haven't got time for that. And you
Mm.
think, you know, so this is why I love going back to, you know, talking to you about Fig and Mathewson and Lonergan, because we're trying to keep these systems alive, you know. And
Yeah.
I think the stuff's relevant as well. It's relevant in terms of physicality. You know,
Yeah.
it works. It works.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, modern boxers should have at least kind of a theoretical introduction to or other. I will explain it differently. I think modern boxers of today, they deserve to know where their fighting art is coming from,
Yeah.
and therefore, sure, we know that the modern boxing has its roots in the art of defense, which means what they are doing is essentially swordsmanship, basing on the broadsword and the smallsword with their fists, because that is what James Figgs did. So we already have in our broadsword manuals the connection to the prize fights, the stage gladiators. For example, Thomas Page was a student of Timothy Buck, who was a stage gladiator. And Donald McBain himself was later a stage gladiator. So for the people who are listening, of course, not knowing what is a stage gladiator, of course, they know the term gladiator. So show fighter or martial artist or swordsman in the arena of the Roman Empire. But in the 18th century, they were picking up this idea of public fighting with weapons and also unarmed. And in the late, we don't know exactly when it started, but we know it started we have already mentioning of it around the late 17th century. And in the first half of the 18th century, we could say we have a lot of material that we can find, like newspaper articles and Donald McBain mentioning that he did these prize fights, and we have pictures of James Figg and Jack Broughton. So until from the first half of the 18th century, we know for sure that it was a thing. Yeah. And these stage gladiator fights were public fights on a stage, on a wooden stage, like a boxing ring, so a little bit higher on, like we see here. And so the people can imagine like this, you know, you see James Figg standing here with his sword, his bald head. Above we have some single sticks, which they were also using. This is maybe a kind of a wicker shield, a wicker targe, or maybe wicker buckler. And we see this guy here like a referee holding a quarterstaff and so on and so on. And James Figg having here his backsword. And they were doing sometimes like show fights, like, okay, you do this and then I do that. They were doing free fights with sharps. They had some restrictions. For example, thrusting was prohibited because it was seen as being too dangerous. But there were bloody fights with cudgels, with quarterstaffs, with falchions. I think I even saw some articles talking about smallsword on the stage. They used offhand weapons like the parry dagger. They used offhand weapons like the buckler, two weapons which had no use in the military or in civilian life anymore in the 18th century, but the stage gladiators still used them. But they also used the targe. We have descriptions of them using the targe, but it was a simple targe, just plain wood. So they're describing how they fight, and then the wood, you know, is getting splinters, and the targe finally is breaking. And they did several rounds. Sometimes they did like, okay, 1 round of backsword, 1 round of backsword and dagger, 1 round of backsword and buckler, 1 round of cudgels, 1 round of quarterstaff. And hey, I must be crazy. Let's do 1 more round of unarmed combat or something like that. So these prize fights were quite popular. And people like James Figg started also to systemize the fencing theory into the unarmed combat. We don't know exactly what the rules were around 1700, or if there were any rules at all. I found some online article where it is mentioned that maybe James Figg even did kind of a ground submission. So ground fighting might have been allowed still, but we don't know. We only know what they were doing and were not allowed to do when the Brockton rules came up, the first rule set of modern boxing. And this was a time around 1740s, 1750s when the weapon fights were, becoming more unpopular. Maybe they were also restricted by law because they were too dangerous, but because death in these fights was not the intention, but they might happen. So, for example, what you read quite often is that they get a lot of cuts to their head, like McBain describes. He says you can have a lot of cuts on your head and bleed from many wounds, but it's not deadly. I think in Ben Miller's excellent book on Irish swordsmanship, there is one guy who was, no, it is here in the Lessons of the Broadsword Masters. There is a description of one fight. There is one here. Here's a description of a fight. I read it quickly. The last man known to have died in such a contest, so in a prize fight, was Thomas Barrett, also known as Old Chopping Block. So this was his nickname, Old Chopping Block, who died on the stage in Dublin in 1753. And there's an account of one of Barrett's last fights. So he had the name Old Chopping Block, I think, for a reason.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
And around 750, it started to switch from weapon fights to unarmed combat, which was known back then already as pugilism or boxing.
Yeah.
So the weapon fights died out in this sense. And I mean, there were fighters like Donald McBain, old soldiers, but in theory, everyone could take part in this. And I think there were part-time prize fighters, but I think there were also wandering swordsmen who were traveling from town to town, trying to show their skills. We have pictures of this, like some guy sitting on a horse in a crowd on a market, and with all his scars on his face and his broadsword ready, stripped down to his shirt, ready to combat and waiting for someone to challenge him. Yeah. So these were professional fighters in the sense of, what you could maybe sometimes, I think there is still a tradition in Europe of boxing and wrestling on kind of, fairs. Where some drunk guys can, come up on the stage and try to knock out the professional fighters, something like this.
Well, up in the
back then it was kind of a thing.
Yeah, up in the northeast of England, where I'm from, near Newcastle, Northumberland, and that area, they still have Cumberland or Northumberland wrestling at the country fairs. So you'll have a country fair, and there'll be some guys doing maybe a single stick. I've seen this before, doing a single stick demonstration, and then they'll do some Cumberland, Northumberland wrestling, which is very similar to Highland back wrestling, there's still a sort of in these smaller communities in the northeast and in the lowland areas of Scotland. There's still this tradition of men getting together and having a wrestle, and a little bit of single stick as well, which is quite unusual because obviously this, but for the listeners who probably don't know this, there's quite a tradition of single stick fighting in the UK, certainly in Great Britain, all the way up to the 50s, 1950s. And often in the early 1900s, it would be decided, just like the gladiatorial fights, by first blood. So if you hit the head and get blood, then you've won the match. And then somebody else would throw their hat into the ring, as it were, to challenge, and they could make money like that. But there's something I quite like the single stick tradition. I love.
The single stick tradition is interesting because it was kind of a poor man's swordsmanship. So you could do all the broadsword movements with a single stick, and then they had, of course, kind of these single stick games similar to what fencing schools did in Germany in the 16th and 17th century with the Dusak, so fighting for the first bloody head wound. And there are pictures of these so-called old gamesters standing always in this kind of hanging guard, having a scarf between their legs, holding the guard like here to protect their head, and then trying to do head blows without any footwork. And this is similar to the student fencing in Germany, which is still done, you know, with the sharp sabers. And this is a tradition which was closely connected to these stage gladiator fights, but also to the swordsmanship training. And we can see this in the 18th century, that even when public weapon fights died out slowly in the second half of the 18th century, but still in the martial arts schools, Jack Brockton was still teaching the pugilism, but also the backsword and the quarterstaff, because it was connected. It was the kind of art of defense which people wanted to learn, and which these guys were teaching. And it's interesting, however, when you watch, when you look at modern boxing. So personally, for my broadside, I can learn a lot from modern boxing still. And I think also people who do modern boxing can learn a lot from broadsword and old pugilism. And I think this is quite a fascinating period, when this very English or very British thing of two guys fighting bare knuckle on a stage in front of the crowd, having, you know, they were doing bets and whatnot about money, and they had their patrons, so like you know, rich sponsors helping them, being kind of, you know, semi-professional fighters, and people like Daniel Mendoza and Gentleman John Jackson and Bill Richmond. They were doing this kind of semi-professional because they knew if they break their hands in a fight, they could not do. I think Bill Richmond was he learned to be a carpenter, and if he break his hands in a fight, he would not be able to do his job anymore. No. I mean, at least not with the medical attention he would get back in the time. So that also had a lot of influence, of course, on the way they fought. But I really like. I think it's fascinating, this kind of sports spectacles in the 18th century. I think I've read one time that one fight, I think it was a Daniel Mendoza fight, who was kind of a rock star during his times as a pugilist. That I think the article about his fight had more attention than, I think, kind of the invasion of Napoleon or something like that. You know, people were more interested in the sporting event. And we have a lot of newspaper articles about it, and we also have manuals about how they fought, how they did this kind of pugilism. So it's kind of interesting to see these old boxing manuals and these old boxing spectacles, and they had, like, you know, 20, 30 years before that article is, you know, that they did still weapon fights on the stage to entertain the crowd and make some money. And they were potentially dangerous because, speaking here of a pure old chopping block, the fighter Thomas Barrett, who was the last one who died, I think he got a cut into his belly. Yeah. And then he died later on the wounds, because everything which was injuring your internals would be after several days of infection would be very deadly, because, you know, a wound on the arm or a cut here on the head or something like that, you could treat it quite well with the medicine back then. But a thrust or a cut into the belly, that was a different kind of thing. Internal bleeding, something like that, they could not manage that quite well.
Very much a mortal wound, isn't it? I think that's the end, isn't it? The thing I noticed about Fig as well, I think I'm right in saying this, you know, I think he had 270 fights in his day, but he only lost one. And you think, he's, you know, 269 fights, it's unbelievable. You know, the modern pugilist maybe have 30, 40 fights, maybe 50. I know in Thailand it's different because they're doing it for a living. So I've got a friend who's had 500 fights. You know, it's ridiculous. You know, his whole career has been fighting, and he's, you know, he's in his late 30s now. He's retired, but 270 fights. You know, where potentially you could get killed. It takes a certain type of individual, you know. To be able to go back to that day after day, week after week, you know. And run a fencing school and be
the people back then, I mean, the fighters taking part in these fights, they were tough men. So the earliest pugilists, they were, you know, like a butcher or someone, a sailor or someone working on the dockyard. I think Jack Brockton was, in his young age, he was carrying a lot of heavy things in the dockyards of London or something like that. And of course, we have to keep in mind that people like James Figg and Jack Brockton, they stand out in history because they were the ones who were really able to make a living of that, to have a career. They were running Bear Gardens, this famous gladiatorial arena down in London. And of course, in every small village, on every fair, on every marketplace, you could set up a stage and could say, okay, here I go, I'm fencing master, call me whatever from there and there, and I did already this and that, and I'm master of defense, and I challenge this guy who is a local, you know, the local bloke here in this town, and people can bet, and you can fight for a prize, and of course it was about money, it was about fame, and I mean, we have some very tragic stories also in this kind of old boxing and stage gladiator history. I mean, we know that Jack Brockton, he had quite a successful life, but he killed a man in the ring, which caused him, he was very shocked about it. So these fights were kind of without any rules, as we understand it. So he was setting up the first rules. But the so-called Brockton rules he set up were, you know, only little restrictions, what you can do and what you cannot do. And a lot of is about where the fighters have to stand and they have to scratch the line and they have to fight toe to toe, and how we split the purse of the fight, you know, how's the price, who get what, and how many seconds he can have with him in the ring, who attend him and help him. But from techniques which are prohibited, you can say, yeah, okay, this and that is forbidden, but everything else goes. So they could use headbutts, they could use elbow strikes, they could use hammer fists and all those things. And of course, in old pugilism, there was always the aspect of wrestling, because when you had clinch fighting, you could throw down an opponent, which is very useful because the round ends and you have a short break when you throw down your opponent. You're not allowed to strike him anymore, and you're not allowed to grab him below the waist, but stand-up wrestling like Greco-Roman or backhouse wrestling you could do. And this is also quite fascinating because we find a lot of connection between close quarter techniques with the broadsword or the small sword and wrestling techniques of the period, and in between there are pugilism wrestling techniques, so the wrestling aspect of pugilism. So for example, we have the back heel. The back heel is a throwing technique which is used by Thomas Matthewson with a broadsword in close quarter combat, but it's also a technique which was used in pugilism, and it's a technique which is still a basic technique to throw someone down, for example, in backhold wrestling, which is done still today. So this is quite fascinating, the aspect of fencing theory going into the fist fighting aspect. So you have like, you know, like parry and counter and whatnot with the fists. And also you have the wrestling techniques, which are already in the weapon combat and then being used in the unarmed fighting, where the fists may be the main weapons, but when you come close, then of course you use your elbow and then you throw down the guy.
No, I mean, the links between all of these things are fascinating if you trace them back. Now, I don't want to put a downer on things, but we've done over an hour now, believe it or not.
As usually.
I know it's crazy, but actually we could leave it at this point where we're starting to look at the pugilism and the wrestling, because I think we can spend quite a bit of time going into a little bit more detail about wrestling, and because, you know, as you quite rightly said, there's a lot of links between the back heel sweep technique you use, you know, and then closing command. I mean, how many of the techniques that I use with the broadsword where you're wrapping the opponent up and hitting them with the pommel of the broadsword. And that, of course, links to what you can do with your hands when you're clinching someone to wrestle them. You know, so I mean, this is a whole other topic that we can spend another hour talking about.
The unarmed combat. When people talk about unarmed combat, still in HEMA, unarmed combat is a niche. It's still a small part. And it's great that back then, I think Martin Ostwick in UK started the Noble Science event, which has, I think, kind of a spin-off event in France, and also in Germany, where I took part 2 times or 3 times, I don't know. So the unarmed combat of HEMA is something which is still a field where many people can play, and where there's a lot of still to be explored by pioneers, because you know, German longsword, of course, you can still go in many details, and also Highland broadsword is quite well researched. There's still a lot of details to be found out, but from the basic, you can say these are fields which are quite very well explored, and you have good teachers and good researchers about it. For unarmed combat, many people think, medieval wrestling. I know medieval wrestling. Yeah, of course, but there's also wrestling in the 18th century. There's so-called Cornish hack wrestling or in play. We have the traditional wrestling styles which are still existing, like jacket styles, like Cornish wrestling or Breton Guren. We have the pugilism and so on and so on. So there's a lot to explore in the 18th century, and it's a good thing to say, in the 18th century we have the art of defense, or the noble science of defense, which means a gentleman knows how to use bladed weapons, blunt weapons, but also his own body to, you know, defend against ruffians and knock out, you know, or throw down.
A complete warrior. That's the thing. Yeah. I always thought it was odd that.
And they are they are technically and historically connected. It's not like, you learn wrestling and pugilism and it's a complete different martial arts. No. Your fencing theory is already in this pugilism, because it's basing on this fencing theory to use your fist systematically.
Yeah.
So this is quite a cool topic to fill another hour with it.
Oh, without a shadow of a doubt. So what I'll do, Heiko, I'll say thank you for sharing a beer with me and a conversation that is very interesting. And we'll
this is my second one, by the way.
I've only got the one, sadly. I've only got the one.
You always need a backup. You always need a backup.
And on that drunken note, I'll say good night, Heiko.
Good night to you.
Okay, you take care, mate. Take care.
Yeah, bye.
Bye now.